Today, we're diving into a landmark legal case that really hinges on a tragic death, a series of desperate letters, and a court's struggle to define a simple but powerful phrase, soon before death. This is the story of a case that would forever change how dowry deaths are prosecuted in India.
You know, the real heart of this case is in the victim's own words. In letters she sent to her parents, she wrote about an urgent need for money and spelled out the ongoing harassment and dowry demands. These weren't just letters, they were a cry for help that would become absolutely crucial evidence. And just so tragically, that help didn't get there in time. On September 17, 1992, less than a year into her marriage, she was found dead at her husband's home. The cause? Fatal burn injuries, an unnatural death that would kick off a legal battle that lasted for years. So that legal battle eventually became the Supreme Court case of M. Srinivasulu versus the state of Andhra Pradesh. It's a case that started with a bride's heartbreaking death and ended up setting a major legal precedent for the whole country.
All right, so let's introduce the key individuals here. First, we have the deceased, a young woman who had been married for less than a year. The primary accused number 1, was her husband, M. Srinivasulu, and accused number 2 was his mother, the victim's mother-in-law.
The timeline of what happened is, well, it's just chillingly straightforward. When they got married, her family provided a dowry, cash, gold, the usual things. But it wasn't long before the harassment started. The threats got so bad that she actually fled back to her parents' home multiple times. Each time, she was convinced to go back after her husband and mother-in-law promised they'd treat her better. And just 2 months after she returned for the last time, she was dead.
Okay, so this brings us right into the courtroom, where the case became this fierce battle over what could actually be proven. The prosecution and the defense, well, they were about to present two very, very different versions of the truth.
So the prosecution, they built their case on a few key pillars. First, the incredibly powerful testimony from the victim's parents. They also had proof of a specific demand for 5,000 rupees. And most critically, they had those letters she wrote home, exhibits P2 through P7, which documented the absolute torment she was going through.
The arguments in the courtroom just clashed. Big time. The defense claimed the letters were fakes, and they made a big deal about there being no eyewitnesses to her death. They even tried to argue the parents' testimony was unreliable because of their grief. But the prosecution fired back brilliantly. They said, look, the letters perfectly back up what the parents are saying. The pattern of abuse is the real proof. And this is the kicker, the defense never even tried to challenge the letters' authenticity when they had the chance in court.
So, this all brings us to the central question of the entire case, right? Even with this clear pattern of cruelty, was it actually enough to meet the super strict legal definition of a dowry death? To answer that, we've got to take a look at the law itself.
Let's break down the specific law we're talking about here. Section 304B of the Indian Penal Code. Now, this law was specifically created to fight the horrible problem of dowry-related deaths, but it has some very precise requirements you have to meet.
To get a conviction, the prosecution had to prove 5, and I mean 5 specific things. 1, the death was unnatural. Check. 2, it happened within 7 years of marriage. Check. 3, she was subjected to cruelty. Check. 4, that cruelty was all about a demand for dowry. Check. And 5, this is the one that became the whole point of this case. The harassment had to have happened soon before her death.
So with all the evidence presented and the law laid out, the case finally reached its climax. It was time for the Supreme Court to deliver its final verdict.
First up, the court considered all the evidence against the husband, M. Srinivasulu.
He was found guilty. The court sentenced him to 7 years of rigorous imprisonment for the crimes of dowry death and cruelty. But then, the court turned its attention to the second accused, the mother-in-law.
And in a pretty surprising turn, she was acquitted. She walked free. The court found that even though the parents' testimony mentioned both of them were involved, there wasn't enough specific evidence that detailed her own individual acts of harassment. So she was given the benefit of the doubt.
So what's going on here? Why the completely different outcomes? And how did the court convict the husband based on harassment that wasn't necessarily happening the day before or even the week before she died? Well, it all came down to how the court interpreted that 5th ingredient, soon before her death.
And this, right here, is where the case makes legal history. The court's interpretation of this one, seemingly vague phrase created a powerful new legal standard that's still used today.
The court introduced what we now call the proximate and living link test. They ruled that soon before doesn't have to mean immediately before. It doesn't mean minutes or hours.
Instead, prosecutors just have to establish a clear causal connection, a living link between the harassment and the death, and this was a total game changer.
This slide gives you the perfect analogy. Just think of it like a line of dominoes. The court isn't just looking at the final domino to fall, it's looking for the entire chain of events. The dowry harassment has to be a key domino in that unbroken chain that ultimately led to the tragic outcome.
Honestly, you really can't overstate the impact of this single ruling. It created a legal legacy that continues to shape how these incredibly difficult and sensitive cases are handled even today. So here's the rundown on why this case is still so important. It established that proximate and living link test as the gold standard. It made it clear that any demand for property connected to a marriage can be considered dowry. It validated the power of a victim's own words from their letters and diaries as real evidence. And because it's a Supreme Court judgment, it became the binding law of the land.
This case gives us one possible answer, but it also leaves us with this really profound question that the justice system is still grappling with every single day. Without eyewitnesses, how can the law ever truly get behind the closed doors of a home to uncover the truth and deliver real justice?
The proximate and living link test doesn't solve every single challenge, not by a long shot, but it represents a crucial step forward, a foundational principle that allows courts to see the full, tragic story and not just the final, terrible chapter.